Before the first shot was fired at Lexington Green on the morning of April 19, 1775, the men standing in the cold pre-dawn air were not soldiers in any professional sense. They were farmers, leather workers and blacksmiths and tavern keepers, and at least one minister. Most of them had walked no more than a mile from the houses their fathers or grandfathers had built on the same ground, in some cases on land those earlier generations had cleared from woodland already a century old by 1775. Their names were already old in the county by that morning: Parker, Munroe, Harrington, Davis, Buttrick. Some of those names had been in Massachusetts for 5 and 6 generations, long enough that the men carrying them had stopped thinking of themselves as coming from anywhere else at all. The British column that marched out of Boston the night before was hunting military stores. What it found instead, strung out along a 16-mile corridor from Lexington to Concord and back to Charlestown, was a population that had already made a decision. By the time the last shots faded that evening, 73 British regulars were dead, and a further 174 were wounded. The colonial militias paid in blood as well, but the surnames on those muster rolls are still carried by millions of living Americans today. The question this record exists to examine is a direct one. Is your name on that list? And if it is, what does the genealogical record actually tell you about where that name came from and how it arrived at you? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The muster rolls for April 19th are among the most carefully studied documents in American military genealogy. And the reason is not only the engagement's historical weight, it is what those rolls contain: a near-complete cross-section of colonial New England's founding bloodlines gathered in one place across a single day of fighting. The men came from Lexington, Concord, Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, Sudbury, Framingham, and a spread of other Middlesex County towns, answering a system of alarm riders and church bells and signal guns that had been designed, in some ways, for exactly that morning. They were predominantly of English descent, drawn from families who had crossed the Atlantic in the great Puritan migration of the 1630s and 1640s. But the ancestry behind those companies was not as straightforward as the standard account suggests. Running alongside the English surnames were Scottish names, a small number of Irish names, and names that had already been anglicized before the family arrived in Massachusetts. There were surnames that a genealogist following them backward through the colonial record finds crossing multiple ethnic and regional boundaries before settling into the muster roll as what appears, on the surface, to be simply another Massachusetts family that had always been there. The first name in the record that morning at Lexington was Parker. Captain John Parker commanded the Lexington Militia Company. He had perhaps 77 men on the Green when the British column arrived, though accounts from that morning disagree on the exact count. Parker was 45 years old, already dying of tuberculosis, and was dead before the year was out. His surname had been in Middlesex County for over a century before that morning, arriving with the Puritan migration of the 1630s. The Parker name in England traces to occupational origin, a park keeper or gamekeeper, and in colonial Massachusetts it spread through a set of founding families that intermarried across the county's early towns over 5 and 6 generations. Munroe is the second name the record places at Lexington in significant numbers. Sergeant William Munroe commanded the detail that guarded the house where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying on the night of April 18th, and he was on the Green when the British column arrived. The Munroe family had been in Lexington since the 1680s. By 1775, they were one of the most deeply established clans in the town, and the old Munroe family burying ground still stands in Lexington today, its stones worn to near illegibility. The surname has Scottish Gaelic roots, and it arrived in New England both through the Puritan migration and through later waves of Scottish immigration that brought the same name into regional communities through entirely separate genealogical channels. Genealogists tracing specific Munroe branches backward from the colonial Massachusetts record sometimes find that lines appearing Anglo-Protestant on the surface carry Gaelic naming conventions 3 or 4 generations back, absorbed into the English-dominant framing of the colonial record without annotation. Harrington appears on the Lexington muster roll in the most devastating way. Caleb Harrington was killed at Lexington that morning, shot while attempting to reach his house near the meeting house on the Green. The Harrington surname in Massachusetts was already old by 1775, tracing to the same 17th century migration wave that brought the Parkers and the Munroes. It is an English name derived from place names in the north of England, Harrington in Cumberland, Harrington in Northamptonshire, and it spread through New England's founding communities in the 1600s before establishing itself in Lexington and its surrounding towns. The family burying ground in Lexington contains Harrington stones that predate the Revolution by 3 and 4 generations. The name has been traced in Lexington town records with enough continuity that the genealogical corridor from colonial settlement to the morning of April 19th is among the better documented lines in the muster roll record. Tidd is a name the standard histories tend to pass over quickly, but it appears on the Lexington muster rolls and it carries a migration history worth following. Thomas Tidd was present at Lexington on the morning of April 19th. The Tidd surname arrived in Massachusetts with the first generation of Puritan settlers and is comparatively rare, which makes it one of the more genealogically useful names in the entire April 19th record for anyone trying to establish direct descent from that morning. Rare surnames function as genealogical anchors in a way that common surnames cannot. A Parker could be descended from any of dozens of colonial Parker families spread across a half-dozen New England colonies. A Tidd, carrying that specific surname forward into the present, has a much narrower corridor to trace backward through. The name appears in Middlesex County records consistently from the mid-17th century forward, embedded in a family network woven into the town structure of that part of the county long before April 1775 made those towns famous. Smith and Brown present the most immediate genealogical challenge among the 18 surnames, and for the same reason. Both are among the 30 most common names in colonial Massachusetts, and both require working through town records, church registries, probate files, and land records rather than surname alone to establish which branch a living person descends from. Multiple Smith families and multiple Brown families were in Middlesex County in 1775, and multiple men with either name answered the alarm from different towns that morning. Both names trace primarily to English origin in the colonial Massachusetts record, but both also appear as the most common anglicization applied to surnames from other languages carrying the same occupational meaning. The German Schmidt became Smith in the American record with enough regularity that genealogists documenting the colonial German community sometimes find the original surname disappears entirely within a generation of arrival, absorbed into the English-dominant spelling convention that colonial clerks and church registers imposed on any name they found difficult to record as their own conventions required it. Reed is a surname the April 19th muster rolls contain in multiple spelling variants, and the variation itself is genealogically significant. Reed, Reed, and Reed all appear in the colonial Massachusetts record as iterations of the same name. The Reed spelling in colonial New England often indicates English or Welsh origin. Reed, where it appears, tends to point toward Scottish ancestry. The Reed variant is common in family lines established in New England's first generation of settlement and reflects phonetic spelling conventions that bore little relationship to the family's actual national origin. Following a Reed line backward through the Massachusetts record requires close attention to those spelling shifts, which occur when families moved between counties or when different clerks recorded the same name according to their own conventions rather than any standard the family recognized. Davis is the name the record associates most directly with sacrifice at Concord. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton commanded his company's advance to the North Bridge on the morning of April 19th, where the first organized colonial volley against British regular troops was fired. Davis was killed in that exchange, one of the first men to die at Concord, and his body was carried back to Acton, where his widow Hannah was left with 4 children under 10. The Davis surname traces primarily to Welsh and English origin in the colonial record. It is among the most common names in Wales, derived from the given name David, and Welsh families who came to Massachusetts in the Puritan migration carried it into a colony where it was already well established enough to appear unremarkable in any church registry by the mid-17th century. Barrett is the name the Concord record centers in its command structure. Colonel James Barrett was the militia commander for the Concord area, and his farm on Barrett's Mill Road was the primary storage location for the military supplies the British column had marched from Boston to find and destroy. The Barrett name in Massachusetts traces to English origin, arriving in the colony in the first and second waves of Puritan settlement. It is a name with a particular concentration in parts of Essex and Middlesex counties, which reflects the Puritan pattern of chain migration. Specific English parishes sending their members to specific American communities, reproducing the social structure of the town they left across 4,000 miles of ocean. The Barrett family line in colonial Massachusetts can be followed through town land records, church membership lists, and probate documents from the mid-17th century forward, with a degree of continuity uncommon for records from that period. Hosmer and Buttrick appear together at the critical moment of the North Bridge engagement, and they are worth placing beside each other in the genealogical record because they represent two distinct streams of early New England settlement that ended up in the same town at the same moment of irreversible decision. Joseph Hosmer was adjutant to the Concord militia and was one of the men who urged Major John Buttrick to advance to the bridge against the British position. Buttrick was the officer who gave the order to fire. Both surnames trace to English origin and arrived in Massachusetts in the 17th century's first and second waves of Puritan migration. Both cluster in Concord and its surrounding towns in the colonial record, and both appear in the genealogical literature as names that remained geographically concentrated in that same Concord corridor for several generations after April 19th. Prescott belongs in this record through the night that preceded the morning. Dr. Samuel Prescott of Concord was the man who completed the midnight ride on April 18th, after Paul Revere was captured by a British patrol near Lexington and William Dawes turned back. Prescott rode on to Concord and delivered the alarm that gave the militia there the hours they needed to organize and move the military stores Barrett was guarding. The Prescott surname had deep roots in Middlesex County by 1775, tracing to English origin, the name derived from a Lancashire place name meaning priest's settlement. The family appears consistently in county records across the period from the mid-17th century forward, and the connection to April 19th runs through both the Midnight Ride documentation and the Concord militia muster rolls for the engagement itself. Fisk appears in the Lexington record and traces to the earliest period of Puritan settlement with a geographic specificity worth noting. The Fisk family arrived in Massachusetts in the 1630s as part of the first generation of migration from East Anglia, specifically from Suffolk and Norfolk, the regions that supplied a disproportionate share of the colony's founding population. The surname's concentration in colonial Massachusetts reflects that East Anglian origin with some precision. It is not a name that appears frequently in the colonial record as an anglicization of anything else, which makes it a relatively clean genealogical indicator for people who carry it today and are trying to trace a line backward toward the founding period. Wheeler and Hayward both appear across multiple town companies in the Middlesex County militia structure and trace to English occupational origin. Wheeler derives from the craft of wheel-making and appears in the colonial Massachusetts record from the early settlement period. Hayward derives from the officer responsible for managing community grazing enclosures, the Hayward in older English usage, and the name established itself in Middlesex County communities by the mid-17th century. Both appear in the militia structure of those communities by the time of the April 19th muster, and both are common enough in the colonial record to require specific town-by-town tracing rather than surname alone, but uncommon enough in the modern American record that people carrying either name have a real genealogical corridor to follow backward toward that morning. Emerson is in the April 19th record in a specific and well-documented way. Reverend William Emerson of Concord served as chaplain to the Concord militia and was present at the Northbridge engagement. He died the following year while serving as a chaplain in the Continental Army. He was the grandfather of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that later literary connection has made the colonial Concord-Emerson line one of the better documented branches in Massachusetts genealogical literature. The name traces to English origin and had been in the colony since the mid-17th century, appearing consistently in Concord town records across the period from the original settlement forward. Locke appears in the Lexington area militia records and traces to English origin in the colonial Massachusetts record. The Locke family was in Middlesex County from the early colonial period and documented in the town records of communities in the Lexington corridor for several generations before 1775. The name is not among the most common colonial surnames, which makes it a useful anchor for genealogical tracing for people who carry it today and are working backward toward the founding communities of that part of Middlesex County. Farrar rounds out the 18 with a surname that appears in the Concord area records and traces to English occupational root, connected to the work of a farrier or metal worker. The Farrar family was in the Concord corridor from the early colonial settlement period forward, appearing in militia-adjacent documentation from that community. Like Locke, it is uncommon enough in the modern record that it carries genuine genealogical weight for anyone trying to establish a line back to the founding families of the Middlesex County communities that answered the alarm on April 19th. What these 18 names share, taken together, is not just a morning in April 1775. They share a position in the genealogical record of colonial New England that is unusually well documented by the standards of that period. The muster rolls were compiled and verified in the years immediately following the engagement by pension committees and town selectmen who had a concrete interest in establishing exactly who had been where that day. That unusual care means the documentary record behind these surnames is more reliable than most military genealogical records from the same era. But the record, careful as it is by the standards of its time, still has gaps. And those gaps, when the DNA evidence is placed alongside what the documents contain, tend to show a pattern. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The most consistent gap in the April 19th muster rolls becomes visible when you examine the racial composition of the militia companies in detail. The colonial Massachusetts militia was not an exclusively white Anglo-Protestant institution by 1775. Free black men served in Lexington and Concord area companies. Prince Estabrook of Lexington was wounded at Lexington Green that morning, and his name appears in the pension records. Estabrook carried no surname that the muster roll chose to record. That absence is itself a piece of data about how the colonial record was built and what it was designed to capture. His presence in the engagement is documented, and it points to a pattern running through multiple town companies from that day. The muster rolls record who fought. They do not always record the full ancestry of the families whose surnames appear in them, and those two things are worth keeping separate. The genealogical consequence of this surfaces sometimes without warning for people tracing these lines. Commercial DNA tests run against family trees pointing back to the Lexington and Concord engagement have returned, in cases documented by county historical genealogists, small but consistent percentages of West African ancestry in lines where the documentary record shows nothing but successive generations of recorded white New England families. The mechanics behind that result are not difficult to understand once you account for the demographic reality of colonial Massachusetts. Free black families and people held in bondage were present in Middlesex County communities across the entire colonial period. They lived in close proximity to the founding families whose surnames appear in the muster rolls. Marriage and reproduction across that proximity happened in ways the documentary record, maintained by a social structure with a strong interest in not recording certain kinds of ancestry, often did not reflect. A Brown family in Lexington, a Reed family in Concord, a Smith family in Acton could carry a bloodline that the April 19th muster roll records as simply another Massachusetts family, without any indicator in the written record of what the DNA would later show. The native ancestry question runs through the same period and the same communities in a parallel way. The Nipmuc people were the primary indigenous population of central and eastern Massachusetts before and during the colonial period. By 1775, the Nipmuc communities had been shattered by the violence of King Philip's War in the 1670s, and the survivors had been absorbed into the surrounding English colonial communities in ways the record almost never describes with any precision. Genealogists who have compared the DNA results of families tracing to Middlesex County colonial lines against documented Nipmuc population markers have found what county historical researchers describe as a consistent, if modest, presence of native ancestry in family lines that the documentary record classifies without qualification as English Puritan descent. The Parker line, the Emerson line, the Davis line, the Barrett line, any of them could carry that ancestry forward without the record saying so. The colonial muster roll is a document built to serve the purposes of the social structure that produced it. What it contains is real. What it omits is equally real. The absence of that ancestry from the colonial record does not reflect its absence from the bloodlines. It reflects the structure of the record itself, who maintained it, who had standing to be recorded in it, and what categories the clerks and selectmen and church registrars operated within. The founding families of Middlesex County lived in a far more mixed social and demographic environment than the clean categories of the muster roll suggest. What the DNA shows, when run against family trees pointing back to any of these 18 surnames, is sometimes a confirmation of the documentary record and sometimes a complication of it. Both outcomes carry genealogical weight, and neither one changes what the muster rolls themselves contain. For people whose family trees point back to any of these 18 surnames, the documentary starting point is the same regardless of what the DNA eventually shows. The Daughters of the American Revolution maintains a database of verified patriots from April 19, 1775. The National Archives holds the pension files submitted by surviving veterans and their families in the early 19th century, many of which contain sworn depositions naming specific participants, their companies, and their commanders. The Massachusetts State Archives has published extensive research on the town militia rolls, and the county historical societies in Middlesex County maintain collections focused specifically on the April 19th record. The pension files deserve particular attention from anyone beginning this research. Under federal legislation passed in 1818 and again in 1832, veterans of the Revolution or their widows were eligible to apply for pensions, and the applications they submitted required detailed descriptions of military service. Applications from men who fought at Lexington and Concord contain sworn testimony about which company they served in, who commanded them, what they witnessed, and who else was present. For surnames like Parker, Munroe, Davis, Barrett, Hosmer, and Buttrick, multiple pension applications have been transcribed and are available through the National Archives and through the genealogical databases that have digitized the pension file records. They are the closest thing to first-hand testimony the written record contains from that morning, produced within living memory of the engagement by people who had strong legal and personal reasons to be accurate about what they said. The DNA side of this research has changed substantially over the past decade. Y-DNA testing follows the direct paternal line and identifies haplogroups that align with specific migration patterns and regional population clusters. For men carrying any of these 18 surnames, Y-DNA testing run against the Surname Project databases maintained by the major genealogical testing companies can show whether a given paternal line falls within the cluster of related haplotypes associated with the Puritan migration families from East Anglia and the southern English counties that supplied the majority of Massachusetts' founding population. A match to that cluster does not prove descent from a specific individual at Lexington or Concord. No genetic test delivers that level of specificity, and the genealogical literature is clear on that point, but it places the paternal line within the correct genetic population with a precision that documentary evidence alone often cannot achieve when the paper trail grows thin or contradictory. For women tracing these surnames through their mothers, mitochondrial DNA follows the direct maternal line across the same span of generations. Mount DNA testing run against haplogroups documented in the East Anglian and Southern English founding population of colonial Massachusetts, can show whether a maternal line falls within the genetic population from which those families descended. Mitochondrial DNA does not recombine across generations the way autosomal DNA does. It passes from a mother to her children unchanged, which means that a haplogroup present in a Middlesex County woman in the 1640s can, in principle, be identified in a living female descendant 8 or 9 generations later, with a precision that other types of genetic testing cannot replicate at that distance. The Harrington line, the Fisk line, the Prescott line, the Hayward line, all of them include maternal branches that can be followed backward through the same colonial communities in this way. Autosomal DNA testing, which samples from across the entire genome, captures the broader ancestry picture, but its genealogical usefulness decreases in precision as the generational distance increases. For connections 6 or 7 or 8 generations back, which is the distance most living people are from the men who stood at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the documentary record and the more targeted Y-DNA and mtDNA testing tend to be more informative than autosomal results alone. The autosomal test is more useful for identifying living relatives who share a recent common ancestor than it is for confirming descent from a specific individual in the colonial period. Where all 3 types of evidence point in the same direction, the genealogical argument strengthens considerably. Where they diverge, the divergence is itself worth examining. What the DNA cannot show is the specific engagement. No genetic marker identifies a man who stood at Lexington Green on the morning of April 19, 1775, as distinct from a man who simply belonged to the same family and the same community in a different generation. The muster rolls are what the DNA cannot replace. The documentary record and the biological record are two different kinds of witness to the same lineage, and the argument for descent from any name on those rolls requires both of them working together toward the same conclusion. The 18 names in this record are not the only surnames present at Lexington and Concord. The full muster rolls are larger, and a thorough examination of the pension files and town histories reveals additional names that appear with enough frequency to belong in any comprehensive accounting of who was there that day. But these 18 appear in enough town companies, in enough of the documented pension records and county histories, and in enough of the surname migration literature following the founding New England families outward across the following century, that they represent the surnames most likely to connect to April 19th in a living person's family tree. Parker, Munroe, Harrington, Tidd, Smith, Brown, Reed, Davis, Barrett, Hosmer, Buttrick, Prescott, Fisk, Wheeler, Hayward, Emerson, Locke, Farrar. If your family history carries any of those names and your roots run into eastern or central Massachusetts or Connecticut, or further out along the migration corridors that carried the founding New England families into upstate New York, western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the upper Midwest in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the April 19th record is a real and specific starting point. The pension files are in the National Archives. The town records are in the Massachusetts State Archives. The surname-specific research is available through the county historical societies and the major genealogical associations. The documentary trail is there, incomplete as any trail 3 centuries old must be, but present and recoverable for anyone willing to work through it. What the men who stood at Lexington and Concord that morning left behind was not simply a military record. They left a set of surnames embedded in a specific time and place, in a specific network of families and farms and church communities in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. Those surnames traveled outward through the following 2.5 centuries in directions that no one standing on Lexington Green on April 19, 1775, could have tracked or predicted. They went west with the migrations that opened Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. They went south along the Great Wagon Road and into the Virginia and Carolina hinterlands. Some of them stayed in Middlesex County, in the same towns where the muster rolls recorded them, and their descendants are there still. Some of them changed in ways the documentary record reflects only partially, carrying ancestry the written record did not choose to capture, but that the genome preserved without regard for what any census taker or church registrar later chose to write down. The surname is not the ancestor. It is a door. What the muster rolls of April 19, 1775 offer anyone who finds one of these 18 names in their family tree is a specific, well-documented door, and behind it, a lineage that the record has been tracking in varying degrees of completeness for 300 years. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.